Hi, I'm Warwick Fairfax, the founder of Crucible Leadership, and I'm also the author of Crucible Leadership, Embrace Your Trials to Lead a Life of Significance. On today's episode, we're going to learn what it's like to grow up in the real-life version of Succession, the family media dynasty. We're also going to learn how it's possible to have an Oxford degree, Harvard Business School degree, and Wall Street background, and still make cataclysmically dumb decisions. And finally, we're going to learn how do you bounce back from a $2.25 billion takeover of a 150-year-old family media dynasty. Stay tuned, and we'll have a good discussion.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Leadership and Loyalty. Hey, do me a favor, would you send me a quick note, maybe DM me on one of the big 4 social media outlets, and let us know how you listen to us. Is it Apple Podcasts? Is it Google Podcasts? Some app? Let us know, and also maybe tell me one of your favorite episodes, because I'm going to pick a winner, and I'm going to give a prize worth about $1,500, so very decent. All right, let me ask you, what do you need to do to up-level your leadership? The truth of the matter is, many leaders fail to think big enough, while others are trapped in their own grandiosity. There's a balance between being big enough to hold a grand vision and carry it through, while being genuinely humble enough to think beyond one's own grandiosity. Where is the balance as we walk that tightrope? Well, stay tuned, because that's where we're going on today's show as we examine the crucible of leadership, particularly in the context of multi-generational business. I'm your host, Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything by transforming meaning into action. Curious to know more? Simply go to dovbaron.com. That's DOVBARON.com. This episode of Leadership and Loyalty is brought to you in part by our other podcast, Curiosity Bites. Curiosity Bites is the answer to the question, how can we bring people together who completely disagree? This is exactly what your heart, your mind, your soul has been craving. It's your chance to sit in on some real and deeply meaningful conversations with some of the world's most interesting people. We're talking about neurophysicists. We're talking about neuroscientists. We're talking about astronauts. We're talking about psychologists and philosophers and just really, really interesting people. Simply go to dovbaron.com and find out how you can sign up for and sink your teeth into the delicious Curiosity Bites. As always, you can find both of the shows, of course, on Apple Podcasts or on iHeartRadio or wherever you tune in, including Spotify. We always need your help in staying relevant, so please go over there, wherever there is. And when you tune in, do us a favor, rate, review, and subscribe to the show. If you are a regular listener, big thank you to you for making us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners. We're honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. And you can also listen to us on Google Home or Alexa. Just say, play Dov Baron podcast. Again, thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know. All right, let's strip it down and dive right in. Are you a fan of the show Succession? My wife absolutely loves it. It's about a media mogul who has no plans of stepping aside as the head of an international media conglomerate that's controlled by him and his family. There is an aging, tyrannical patriarch who brutalizes everyone, including the family members who are scrapping like hungry dogs to take over the company. And as someone who has worked with many, many multi-generational family businesses, I can tell you the show may be a parody, but there are some very painful realities, including what's often multiple attempts at solidifying some kind of a takeover, either from the outside forces or from actually family members. The question becomes, does being born into a family business mean you're going to be good at business? And moreover, does it mean you're going to automatically be a good leader, or is that your assumption? If you do get to have succession and you discover that you are in fact a bad leader, can you come back from it? And if so, how? Well, let's find out together, because our guest today is Warwick Fairfax. Warwick lost, wait for this, he lost his family's 150-year-old media dynasty worth $2.25 billion. And that was back then, and that's a while ago. Yet he has emerged to lead a more fulfilling and significant life, helping others beyond their failures and their setbacks. Today, Warwick Fairfax is the founder of Crucible Leadership. He's the host of Beyond the Crucible podcast, which I was honored to be a guest on. And he is the author of the best-selling book, Beyond the Crucible, Embrace Your Trials and Lead a Life of Significance. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help me to welcome the phoenix who has risen from the flames of his own ego as a much better man, Mr. Warwick Fairfax. Welcome, sir.
Oh, thank you so much, Dov. Really great to be here.
I'm excited about the conversation. I think it's an extremely relevant conversation, but I want to start here. In the context of leadership, what's the most frustrating thing that seems glaringly obvious to you, but is so often ignored by others in leadership?
Yeah, I think so often in the world of leadership, we're looking at earnings per share and revenue and market share and all of that, all of which is important. But the inner game, the soul, is something that we rarely talk about. I know you talk a lot about in your work and your book, One Red Thread, Purpose and Meaning. And that's just an area that we don't talk about. We live in a world that may be not religious, but I think increasingly it's a spiritual world, whether it's religion, philosophy, young people especially, they want meaning and purpose as much as any generation for decades. And so as a leader, you want to, if you're leading young people like this, and that shouldn't have to be a motivation, but we need to ask questions of leaders. Think about your soul. If you don't like the word soul, who are you who are you in your inner being? What do you believe? Because we all believe something. Honor that. Don't reject that. Don't just go with the flow and what everybody else wants. And how do you see what you believe and who you are serving a higher purpose, a broader purpose? And what does that mean for you and your leadership? So it's the inner side that, you want outward sustainable success. It's hard to really achieve that if you don't know who you are. And those questions matter.
Yeah, it's those inner questions matter a lot. And I think that we are seeing that more obviously today, but I think that it's become really highlighted in a post-pandemic world where people had time to pause and ask those meaning-driven questions about who they are, about what matters, and that's that's also important. Now let's go back a bit here, because I mentioned in the intro that there was a media dynasty that was your family's. It was 5 generations deep. And, I think it was 1841, John Fairfax, who was your 5th generation's back, bought a very conservative newspaper, the Sydney Herald. And for those of us from Australia, we know the Fairfax Group and Fairfax Media. But he bought the Sydney Herald. And that was the beginning of this thing. What lessons, when you look back at him now, maybe not when you were a kid, because we're all a bit daft as kids, but when you look back at him now, what lessons about leadership did you learn from the founder of Fairfax Media? Who, of course, was your great great-grandfather?
Great. Yeah, you got it. Yeah. No, it's a good question. He was somebody that was successful in the full sense of that word. He founded a successful business. He had, a great relationship with his wife, great, kids. He was an elder at his church, but his employees loved him. This was in the 1800s. Employees didn't typically love their bosses there. There weren't a whole lot of, worker rights legislation, no unions, no government protection. It was a free for all. You could do whatever you want, pretty much, as an employer.
Yeah.
But yet, when he died in the 1870s, they said, we've, lost a valued employer, a valued friend. And so he kind of really walked the talk. I mean, he kind of cared for people. And soon after he bought the company in 1841, Australia went through a big recession, and they were on a knife edge. It could have gone either way. And he said, look, folks, I'm going to have to ask for a cutback in wages, because if we don't, we'll all lose our jobs. And it's better to have something than nothing. There aren't any other jobs for printers back then. He had a business partner, John Fairfax. We're going to cut our pay back. We'll just take pro rata from what's left. But if we hang in there, and back then it's the 1800s. It was just men working as apprentices. He said there'll come a day when you'll be proud to be a herald man, but we'll all get through it, and I'll do what I can to pay you back. And they didn't like that, but they hung in there, and they kept their jobs, and be able to feed their family. So he was somebody that was a smart businessman, but a compassionate one, in an era when business leaders weren't known with their compassion. So there's a lot to learn about how to lead, but as much as he loved the business, and he was a very smart businessman, he cared about his family, about activities outside of work. So we can learn a lot from who he was as a human being, but who he was as a leader too.
Yeah, like you said, he's that kind of leader when he doesn't have to be. And this is the distinction. I think a lot of leaders now are realizing, we got to really pay attention to meaning and purpose, and we got to make sure that we've got a great culture and community. But that's a lot of that is driven out of, oh God, we've got to do it, versus this is who we are. And this great grandfather of yours is operating at that way of being when he doesn't have to, when he could have just cracked the whip and got away with it back in the day. So for me, that's the profound difference between real leadership and what is in trend of the moment. He was like, this is who I am, and this is how I'm going to lead, from being a decent human being as opposed to anything else. What was it like? So let's just give some context here, because I want to, I realize that we do have many multi-generational family members who listen, but we also have many people who are not that and actually have no understanding of that. What was it like to live inside of a multi-generational family with this dynasty? Forget the business for a minute. We're not going to put the business to the side, but this layering upon layering of these, quote, great men, and particularly starting with this man who you just described, your great-great-grandfather. What was that like to live in that milieu, if you will?
There was just huge expectations. What made it worse is, there's obviously expectations at any multi-generation company, but when you have a company that, at its height had, newspapers, TV, magazines, 750 million revenue, 4,000 employees. But, we were reducing the US equivalent of the New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal, Sydney Morning Herald, Age of Melbourne, and the Financial Review. It felt like this was a sacred cause, a legacy, not just a business, but for the nation. It always sought to be impartial in the news columns. And, so it wasn't just like, oh, I got to go and, we make widgets or, rivets or whatever, which is fine. We're providing a service to the nation. And so how could you not go into that? Don't you care about your country? Don't you care about the people of Australia? Don't they matter? Who's going to hold the politicians accountable? Who's going to, because, we never in the news columns favored one party or another. And despite my dad was probably moderately conservative, it didn't matter if it was conservative or Labor, they would go at it. There was no favor for a politician just because. It was, so when you grow up with this ethos, it's really, as folks from Commonwealth or UK would get, it's like growing up in the royal family. I mean, can you imagine Prince William saying to his dad and grandmother, I've had this whole thing. Well, look what happened to Harry. Not easy to get out. You feel like, his popularity, rightly or wrongly, in the UK is maybe not what it once was. It's like, hey, and you would, being from the UK, would be more attuned to this. It's like, we pay for you guys. It comes out of our taxes, I mean, we expect you to live a certain life. That's the social contract. And so I'm not saying it's necessarily right, but the British public expect something from their royals, a certain way of behaving, a duty, and you don't leave. So all that's to say is
that's what I'm saying, that you're living in a family, and we've all not all, but most of us have grown up inside families, and there are social and cultural pressure of a family, in any family, doesn't matter where you are. I mean, if you're born in certain parts of England, you social pressure to be a Man United fan, or whatever it is. It's you can't. Oh, I support Leicester. Are you mad? Like so, it can. That's a pressure, but that's magnified magnificently inside of a multi-generational family business, and then on top of that is this almost patriotic, as you said, that it's tied to the good of our country. Back in the day, it's not and I want people to have a context here, because it's not the it's not the media of today. It's the media of yesteryear, with a non-biased media, et cetera, and an obligation to news being neutral. I want you to sort of share with us, if you can, what it was like to live in that social pressure on a day-to-day basis, not even as going into the business, but just living in it, knowing our family has so much political influence. Our family holds the lives of many in our hands. What was that like as a boy, seeing that as a teenager?
Yeah, I mean, just the sense of duty and obligation. When you grow up in a wealthy business, you typically go one of two directions. One is, if your parents are foolish enough to give you Ferraris and fast cars and whatever, you go down the route of fast cars, drugs. That's one route, maybe self-destruction, hedonistic lifestyle. That's one choice. I kind of went the other direction. I took life very seriously. I got good grades, worked hard, did my undergrad degree at Oxford, where my dad and some other relatives worked, worked on Wall Street, got my MBA at Harvard Business School. I was, if in terms of the prodigal son, I was the one that didn't leave. I was the one that stayed at home and worked hard,
Right.
I didn't throw everything away, so to speak. And so that actually made things exponentially worse, because it's not always that common. So here's a kid who works hard, is bright, and takes life seriously, tries to be humble. Gosh, why wouldn't we want somebody like that in the family business? And so it just increased expectations. But the problem with that is you feel like you're in this gilded cage. You have no choice. And certainly, it's often, maybe do dumb things growing up as a teenager, not always cataclysmic. But for me, if I did anything silly, it'll be on the front pages of the papers. I was very aware of that. You can't afford to make a mistake. If you make a mistake, not only does it hurt yourself, it dishonors the family. And I don't want to dishonor my family, and people depend on us. And even the employees in the company, in some strange paternalistic way, they would look up to the Fairfax family. They appreciate our legacy, our care for quality journalism. People have said in decades since, if the Fairfax family still maintained control, life would be different, almost like a Pollyanna-ish view, So there was this deep respect that they had. So it's just that the pressure to not mess up, the pressure to go in, the pressure to live up to my duty. And this is true for many family businesses, the idea of, well, who am I? What do I believe? And what is it that I enjoy doing? they were irrelevant questions.
Mhm.
You know, I worked on Wall Street, got a Harvard MBA. I don't have that much interest in finance. You know, I know a fair
Mhm.
amount about it, but
Mhm.
it was, oh, well, we've got a bunch of journalists in my family. It might be helpful to have somebody knew something about finance. That was a
Mm.
logical decision, a logical
Right.
choice for the business and the family, but it had nothing to do with what I wanted to do. So it was all about conforming to an image, to expectations, not wanting to mess up, not wanting to disappoint my family, being very, very careful about what I said. And because, it just grew up in this, as I said, gilded goldfish bowl almost. It was a
But
strange existence.
in that context, because as I said, I've worked with a lot of multi-generational families, and we know there are the bad boys, as you said,
Mhm.
the Ferraris and the Cokes, doing coke and all that kind of stuff. But here's you being this good boy, but also having this sense of being um, under pressure and under obligation. In that sense, did you have this feeling of something bubbling underneath the surface, or did you completely dismiss that? What was that like?
Yeah, it was pretty, if it was bubbling, it was like 2 miles under the surface. I mean, it was, basically, I kind of love my dad very much. And he never said, son, you have to do this. It was just understood. And it would have devastated him. Kind of what really, you know, sometimes events seem to make it worse. And it's a whole nother story, but I think it's relevant to your question, is there were different factions within the family, as there typically are in family
Yeah,
businesses, be it big or small.
absolutely.
That's kind of like normal. And so in 1960, my dad was married 3 times. But sadly, when you have a lot more money, sometimes there are more marriages for whatever reason. So in my dad divorce, there was some hard feelings and all. And so he was temporarily removed as chairman. And then 16 years later, in 1976, he was permanently removed by some other members of the family who had enough shares to vote him out. So I was devastated by that. I was 15. How could they do that to my dad? I mean, maybe they had their reasons, but as a 15-year-old kid, I'm thinking this was wrong. How could they do this? And so then my parents and my dad saw me as the heir apparent. One day you go in and fix things, right? And, all of the dumb stuff that management were allegedly doing and what have you, you'll go. So once 76 happened and my dad was shown off as chairman, the expectations increased exponentially. I was going to be the crusader. I was the knight in shining armor that would save the day one day. And I took that mantle full on, hook, line, and sinker. So everything, it just increased the level of expectation. So the idea of what does I want to do in life? How could I let down my dad? I need to restore the company. I need, idealism is good, but the crusader mentality is maybe you could understand, but sometimes bad things happen even with the best of intentions.
Yeah, I totally understand that, and this was I mean, I want people to get a context of this. I mean, if I say the name Rupert Murdoch to you as an audience, you go, yeah, I know who that is. That's Fox, etc. But
Yeah.
you may not know that Rupert, maybe don't know that Rupert Murdoch is actually Australian, and he and Kerry Packer, who were massively powerful people in Australia back in those days, were trying to take out the company as well. So you've got the internal
Absolutely.
forces, and then you've got the external forces that I talked about in the inside. So did you see that wearing on your dad? Did you see that wearing on the family? Because if we put it in context, it's a constant war, and sometimes the enemy is within the walls.
Well, exactly. I mean, back in the 80s, the family held about 50% of the shares. It was publicly held. And so there were corporate raiders circling. There's no question Rupert Murdoch would have loved to have got his arms around City Morning Herald and The Age back pre-internet, pre-digital. They used to call them the rivers of gold because the classifieds, want ads, real estate, employment, they were massive, almost a license to print money. I mean, if the cash flow, return on investment was just huge. Of course, it changed with digital in the late 90s. And so you had to worry about the corporate raiders. And there was this sense that, we were different than other newspaper families, certainly in Australia, in that my dad might have been moderately conservative, but he was intellectually curious. One of his good friends was Bob Hawke, former leader of the trade unions, pretty left-wing at one point, became Labor Prime Minister. But, he loved talking with people whose opinions were different. But, when it came time to the newspaper columns, they were independent. In fact, the current masthead of the Sydney Morning Herald says independent always. So it was never a party paper, and you would never get favoritism whether you were conservative or Labor. Just there was a time in which certain media folks would say, "Oh, he's a mate of mine." A mate of mine means maybe they get preferential coverage. I don't know, because they're a mate. It's great to be mates, but we have a duty to the country. Okay, it's not nothing personal, as they say, but it's country first, people first. Not just being buddies with my mate and, doing something that might, let's help each other out. We were not like that. And so that was also a sense of we need to maintain that, not just for our sake, but for the country's sake. We don't need a partisan paper that, trades favors or what have you, the way it happens a lot in the business world. So all those things, added pressure for all of us and for me, certainly.
So you've got this dynasty that is media. You have this multi-generational family. You've got social pressure inside of the family to be the heir apparent, to step into the role. You've got your dad who's been dethroned. You've now been pressured to become the crusader, to become the savior of the family name. And it's a political leverage point in that we are supporting, or we're here for the country as this neutral voice of reason back in the day. And you've got the rivers of gold, and people are attacking because they want the rivers of gold. That's a lot, right? That is a lot. And as we come back into part two, I want to talk about what that did, how that impacted a young man, because you were in your early 20s, how that impacted you, and how from being on the very straight and narrow, Wall Street, Harvard degree, Oxford, all those, terribly good things to do, and following all the obligation, and then suddenly your whole life gets turned around. So I want to talk about that in part two. This is a very intriguing conversation for you, particularly if you are interested in multi-generational family business. Maybe you're already in it as you listen to this or watch us. But on top of that, if you really want to understand what happens in the world, because I want you to go away right now in the break. I'm going to be back in one click, but in the break, just click on this one question. Ask this one question in Google. How much of the money in the world is controlled by family business? You will be shocked at the percentage. It will blow your mind. So coming into this conversation will change the way you see everything. We're going to be back in one click with our fabulous guest, Mr. Warwick Fairfax, and we're going to continue our delicious conversation. Before we do that, Warwick, please tell our listeners, our viewers, where they can find out more about you, about your business, and about all the resources you have, including your book.
Absolutely. Our website is crucibleleadership.com. My book that came out in the fall of 2021 is Crucible Leadership, Embrace Your Trials to Lead a Life of Significance. We have a podcast, Beyond the Crucible, where we interview all sorts of guests about their crucibles, how they bounce back. Have a blog, active on social media, LinkedIn and Facebook. So yeah, those are some of the ways.
Great. And we'll make sure that we post all of the links to all of those things so that you can find them in the show notes. Okay, so we'll be back in one click. Stay curious, my friends. Stay curious about what it means to live in a gilded cage and how do you break out without dying in the process. We'll be back very soon, so stay curious, my friends. Stay curious.